Bonjour, moi c'est Justin. Hello, my name is Justin. Today we're going to be talking about French stories, Le Petit Dragon by Fingtam Languages. And this book was written to help beginner and intermediate French students to improve their overall French skills using a concept called comprehensible input. The basic idea of comprehensible input is by understanding messages, basically our brains absorb language in a very natural way, to some extent similar to what it's like when we absorb our first language. And this is a theory promoted by Stephen Krashen. And the point of this book is to tell comprehensible input through stories. So this book is composed of one story, but in three different versions: a beginner version, a lower intermediate version, and an upper intermediate version. And the idea is that if you're at the lower level, just start with the lower level, and then you build yourself up to the highest level. And yeah, so that's the point of the book, to just through reading, improving our French skills. Now, I should talk a little bit about my current level in French and why I might be a good person to review this book. So I first took French in high school for 4 or 5 years, something like that. And I got A's in my classes, but I honestly don't really remember what my ability was back then. I think I knew some things, but my reading level was low because I never read a book, and my listening comprehension was low because I never listened to French outside of class. So I knew some things, but my ability was very low, and I forgot quite a lot of it over the years. And I'm sure some things did stick, like numbers and colors and some animals and little things like that, some basic vocabulary. Still kind of was in there in my brain, some basic grammar concepts, but it wasn't a lot. And I started to study French again 12 years later. So I've been studying for about 20 months now, and mostly through reading and listening and flashcards. Not a lot of speaking, honestly, but I'm waiting for that for later, because honestly, speaking doesn't really excite me all that much, but reading really does. And that's my main focus. So the reason I think I'm a good person to actually review this book is that I think I'm far enough along in the process where I can look back and think about the utility of this kind of resource, while at the same time not be so far away from being a beginner that I can't really remember what it's like to be one. So I feel like I'm kind of in a nice sweet spot. So I think I can have an objective opinion about this book. But at the same time, I am just a person on the internet. I'm not any kind of French expert or a native speaker or anything like that. These are just my opinions, but I will do my best to be as honest as I can about this book. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book. So, like I said before, it's telling stories to teach the language of French. And the story Le Petit Dragon, it's about a little dragon who likes to eat donuts, but doesn't like to eat meat. And basically it tells that exact same story 3 times: beginner, middle, and lower intermediate, and upper intermediate. And it's kind of like a fairy tale, but with a little bit of humor and sort of an ironic sense to it. And it's legitimately entertaining, actually. I like it. I think it's actually a pleasure to read. That a lot of beginner material can be quite boring and dry and pretty terribly written, but I think it's generally really well done in that regard. And now in terms of, so I think it's actually totally appropriate for adults. It's not like a kid's story. I mean, in a way it is, but I think adults can enjoy it. I did. And in terms of what it was like for me to read the 3 levels, I would say all 3 levels were pretty easy for me to read. Although I don't really consider myself an advanced reader yet, but we'll talk more about that as I get into my critique. Now the question is, and there was about 5 words throughout the 3 stories I didn't know, but to be honest, those 5 words are relatively obscure. So I'm not too worried about that, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, now we need to talk a little bit about intensive versus extensive reading, because Fingtam Languages recommends intensively reading this book. So the question is, what does that mean? So this book is not very long. It's, I think, 35 pages in my PDF, and that's not very long. And so what do we mean by intensive and extensive reading? And there are kind of extremes, and to be honest, it's more of a spectrum than one or the other. So if we went to the extremes, what is an extreme version of intensive reading? That means to go through the book, sentence by sentence, word by word, and look up every single word you don't know. look up the definition, what it means, and really in the most extreme sense, memorize all those words. Every single word you don't know, memorize each word. And it's intense because you're basically dissecting the book. You're pulling it apart. And I did that exact thing, that idea of looking through every sentence by sentence, word by word, looking up all the words, what they mean, and then actually literally memorizing each word I didn't know. I did that for 2 books, Le Petit Prince and L'Étranger, those classic books that people recommend people read in French. And I learned a lot from that process, but in hindsight, I wouldn't necessarily recommend such an extreme version of intensive reading. And the main reason is because you'll learn a lot, but a lot of the words that you technically learned, you don't really learn, because a lot of words really require just a lot of exposure to actually get. And some words or sentences, like I would memorize technically and know what they sort of mean, but I didn't really know what they mean. My brain was just not ready to really absorb them. I could read the grammar explanations, I could ask someone, I could read the definitions, but it didn't really click because I was trying to understand something my brain was not ready to do. And the comprehensible input or input hypothesis says that it's really just about understanding messages, and I couldn't quite understand it. And but through enough exposure, over time, those things that used to be hard for me are now not so hard anymore. And so so the problem with intensive reading sometimes is that you're trying to force understanding when your brain is not actually ready for that yet. I'm not saying ignore things that are hard, but trying to force understanding where you understand absolutely every single thing, it's not realistic or even really possible. Maybe, so that's what I would say about intensive reading on the extreme end. Now on the other extreme end is extensive reading. This is the idea that you just read, you open your book, you just read, don't look up anything, don't look up any definitions, don't memorize anything, just read until all the words basically through exposure and through context become clear. Now, what are some now, this is great if it works, but the problem is it requires a lot of exposure for this to work. And you have to find material that is just perfectly at the right level so that you can slowly, gradually progress, which is a challenge. And this does work though, of course, because this is how we learn to read as kids. I don't know about you, but I never looked up a single word in a dictionary through most of my life reading books. But somehow I learned all those fancy literary words that you read in books. And it's just through exposure, that's it. And obviously it helps to be a fluent speaker already, you have a good base of vocabulary, but there's still tons of words that only show up in books. And so just through exposure, I somehow learned them all without ever looking them up in the dictionary. So clearly, assuming that, it's not always true, but assuming that the process of learning a second language is somewhat similar to learning your first language, obviously there are differences, then of course extensive reading should work. But again, it takes so much reading over years and years and years and years, and that who cares to do that. So in my opinion, there's kind of a nice middle ground that has the benefit of that extensive reading, so you get all that exposure and that comprehensible input, and so you can actually learn the language, but you could accelerate that process by looking up words and memorizing words. And so my process is kind of in the middle, so don't look up every word, but maybe 1 or 2 per page. Don't memorize every single word in a book, but maybe 100 to 200 words that are the easiest to memorize. And that's basically my process whenever I read a book. I just read the book, maybe look up 1 to 2 words per page. Even if there are more, just skip them. It's not a big deal, just skip them. More, they'll come back if they're important. 1 to 2 words per page, just keep on going, push through even if it's difficult. And then if there seem like there's sentences that might be good to memorize, maybe some good words that you want to memorize, just save the sentence, put them in a flashcard and memorize them. And so I would memorize about 1 to 200 words. And so just keep on doing that, learn the easy words, look up words once in a while, and you get that benefit of extensive reading, but you also get the accelerated learning aspect of intensive reading. So it's a kind of a nice best of both worlds. But I'll talk more about how to apply this idea of intensive versus extensive reading to this particular book in a minute. So let's talk about this book. Actually, why don't we just jump in and talk about intensive reading for this book. I think you should do the same thing. I think you should read it a few times, look up the words as you go, maybe look up every single word. It's not very long. And maybe memorize some of the easier words. There's about 500 unique words in the book. Maybe memorize 50 words, 100 words maybe, if there are that many that you don't know. And that should be good. Don't try and memorize every single one because some of those words just won't be ready. Your brain will not be ready to accept them yet. But just the ones that seemed easy to memorize, and that's probably a good approach. Maybe read each story a few times, and whatever words seem good to memorize, that like your gut seems like they're important, then learn them. But you know what? It's short enough where you can probably just look up every single word you don't know, and you'll probably get some benefit of it. But I'll talk more about. But if you're reading like an entire novel, 300, 400, 500 pages, it's not a very realistic strategy. Maybe do that kind of middle ground thing that I talked about earlier. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about some positives of this book, and just to start us off, because I did overall like it. So one of the most positive things about it is that it uses really good, frequently used vocabulary, like in the top 5,000 words in French. And that's great because it gives you great practice, it gets you ready for these words. They're used all the time, so it gets your brain exposed to them and jumpstarts the process of learning all those words you need to know to read a book, which is a lot. And all the important grammar structures. It doesn't cover every single grammar thing that you probably should know before reading a book, but it does a good job. I would say most of everything is covered to some extent. But again, most of these grammar concepts, especially like the hard ones, the ones that you don't see very often, you'll learn slowly over time the more exposure you get. So even if you like intensively read this book and really dig down and deep into all the grammar concepts, you're not really going to learn them until you've had tons more exposure. So this is just an introduction, not the last step, okay? Another thing I really liked is just an accessible length, right? It's actually appropriate for intensive reading. Even something like Le Petit Prince is way too long for it, and coupled with some literary vocabulary that's not super frequent. It's not the best use of intensive reading time, but because it's short, it's actually possible, and it's less intimidating, right? Like a 500-page book can be intimidating for a learner. So it just kind of gets your foot in the door to get into reading, get into the habit of reading. And again, like I said before, it's actually legitimately entertaining. I do like the story, and I'm actually surprised because as far as I know, Fingtam Language, the person who runs it, I'm not sure that he has a creative writing background, but I thought it was great. I thought it was really good. I enjoyed the story legitimately. And then finally, another thing is that there is an audio recording of the beginner story, so you can listen as you read. It's a nice way to get used to French pronunciation at kind of a regular pace, and so they're all good. Okay, so that's what I would say positive, a lot of good stuff about it. Now, there's a few more points, so I'm going to talk about negatives now, and most of these are honestly kind of nitpicky, so even though I have a few points to say, don't mean that I'm trying to be negative about it. These are my honest opinions, but for the most part, I think there's much more good than there is bad. But what are some negatives about the book? So, first of all, I think the number one most disappointing aspect of this book is the fact that there is no le passé simple. There is none of that tense in this book. So, for those who don't know, this is a tense that whenever you open up a book and you see all these verbs and it looks very strange, that's probably le passé simple, or the past historic. And this is basically the exact same thing as passé composé, except used in storytelling. And I'm really disappointed the upper intermediate level does not include it, because honestly, you cannot read a book without being familiar with this tense. It is literally in almost any novel you ever read. Yes, there are exceptions, L'étranger, the Petit Nicolas, and other examples like that. But that's few and far between. Honestly, almost anything you want to read is going to have the passé simple. And honestly, it's not that hard. It really isn't. Yes, there are some irregular tenses that look weird, but for the most part, it's very regular. You can almost always guess what the verb is from the stem. It's very accessible. It really is. You just have to get used to it like everything else. And you never have to talk in the passé simple. You never have to, because it's a written tense, and odds are you're probably not going to write a novel in French. And if you want to write a novel in French, by the time you're ready to do that, after reading dozens if not hundreds of books, you'll be so used to the passé simple that you won't have to learn it because you've just been exposed to it so much. So I really feel like there's no reason that the upper intermediate couldn't have that. And I really hope that maybe future books in the series, if there is going to be a series, really does include it, because honestly, there's no reason to hide students from this tense. It's just so ubiquitous. It's not really going away. I mean, maybe in like 50 years or 100 years perhaps, but it's even in young adult books, even in younger kids' books, like maybe unless like the really young kids, like it just shows up. It's everywhere, and you can't read a book without it. And so I feel like we just, especially when you're using a book like this, that it's meant to kind of get you ready and kind of keep you safe in this kind of self-contained story, now's the time to kind of get used to it, so that when you jump into Harry Potter and you see that everywhere, it's not going to be quite so scary, in my opinion. Although what's funny is in the book there actually is one or two examples of the passé simple in it. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that was intentional, just to kind of dip your toe into that world, or if it was an accident, but I think the third story should definitely be written using that tense. So that's one criticism. Another one is I don't really like the designation of the levels: beginner, lower intermediate, and upper intermediate. The main thing is that everyone has different interpretations of what that means. I don't even particularly like the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. I'm not a huge fan of thinking about language learning in that way, but I especially don't really like these three terms. Honestly, level 1, 2, and 3 would work perfectly fine, and because honestly, I don't think the third story makes you, if you can understand that perfectly, I can understand it perfectly. Because you understand it perfectly doesn't make you an upper intermediate learner, in my opinion. But again, it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter your level. Just get better. Over time, you'll get better and better. You don't need to label yourself into upper intermediate, lower intermediate, advanced, beginner. These labels don't matter. Just you are where you are. Next day you'll be a little bit better, and that's all that matters. So that's why I don't really like these like level labels. Just 1, 2, or 3, honestly, I think would work so much better. And there's less like value judgment and stuff like that. So not a huge fan of the way the stories were labeled. I know that's kind of nitpicky, but it's kind of a broader topic of, I guess, language learning, where we think about our levels as if they're important. I mean, maybe if you're immigrating into a country perhaps, or have to get into a university, but outside of that, I think levels and talking about that, CEFR and all that stuff, beginner, intermediate, advanced, I think that does more harm than good, in my opinion. Some strange vocabulary choices in the book. As just an example, there was the word quémander, which means like to beg, I guess. Yeah, that's a very rare word. If you look at it in a frequency list, it's the 28th in French. 28,000. Like, that's an extremely rare word. And especially when there's much more common words that would work, like supplier, for example. That's a very common word used to mean to beg, and then there's others as well. And I'm not really sure why, again, this is nitpicky, but it's just kind of strange that there's a few examples of words that I'm just like, what? why would you use that word when, especially in a like beginner or a learner material like this, when there's perfectly fine verbs that could be used. Again, it's so nitpicky, but it was just something I was thinking about. I do think there was a couple grammar errors in the book. There was one example where I'm pretty sure there should have been a subjunctive, either imperfect subjunctive or just regular subjunctive, I guess it's called. I'm not the biggest grammar guy, but what I do basically is when I read books, I read them, try to understand them. If there's like a grammar concept I don't quite get, I'll look it up, and I kind of just learn grammar progressively like that. And you know, over time you get used to things like imperfect subjunctive, which is a very scary tense because it's even rarer than the passé simple, but you get used to it over time. And I was reading the sentence and I read it and I'm like, I'm pretty sure this would be like using subjunctive. It seems kind of strange not to. And I looked it up and I'm pretty sure in that context the subjunctive should have been used. I'm not going to say what it was just out loud just because there's a chance I might be wrong and I'd rather not embarrass myself, but and there was another example where I'm pretty sure the wrong verb was used for it to make sense. But there were just two small examples, and it really doesn't actually matter in terms of learning the fact that like it's like that, because again, these are just two very tiny small examples. Now, kind of a broader, perhaps, critique of the book is that the book is never going to build you reading fluency. Even if there was 10 of these books, it's not really going to, just because it's not long enough. Really, the reading is about exposure more than anything else. And intensive reading is a really good idea, especially when you're a beginner, because it really just jumpstarts your vocabulary, just gets a lot of words in you relatively quickly. But really, the name of the game is exposure. Just how much distance you travel in reading. That's what gets the grammar concepts into your brain. That's what gets the vocabulary into your brain. That's what really gets it deep in there. That gets that comprehensible input going. It's not from like a very short book. So the intensive reading, great idea, but it's not going to get you to the point where you're going to feel comfortable reading Harry Potter, for example. In my opinion, Harry Potter is the easiest novel you can start with. The reason is because it uses relatively simple language, relatively simple situations. The descriptive language is not too bad, and you already know the story. If you're part of pop culture in the last 10 years, you probably either read it in English or seen the movie. So you have the story already in your head. You have the benefit of cognates in English and French, but even if you memorize every single word in Le Petit Dragon, you're not going to be ready to read Harry Potter. Now, does that mean you should not read Harry Potter? No, because I'll talk about that in my conclusions, I guess, but you're never going to feel comfortable reading novels until you actually start reading novels. And honestly, and so in that way, this book is just not going to cut it in terms of getting you ready and feeling comfortable reading novels. That's not a critique exactly of the book, because that's not at all like what the book is trying to accomplish. But just be aware that there's kind of a trap with beginner resources, that you kind of get stuck there and you never actually make that leap to actual real books. Because this book is only 20. I did a little calculator test on the text, and there's 2,462 words in the text approximately. That might include the English descriptions, to be honest, but there's 494 unique words in the book. 494 words, 500 words is very, very little in the grand scheme of things, and really reading requires thousands and thousands of words, and the only way to get there is through that exposure. You can't brute force it with intensive reading past the beginner stage. You really just need that exposure, that wide breadth of reading to get there, okay? And again, it's like reading is an unconscious process. You can't force it, right? Someone said this analogy that reading, it's like watering a plant, right? You plant the seed, you water, you put fertilizer, you let the sun shine on it, and through enough of this stuff, the reading, the extensive of the reading, the plant will grow, your understanding will grow. But if you try and just take the plant and try and stretch it out and try and make it grow, it's not going to work. So you have to give that exposure. You have to have enough reading for this to work. And so, again, it's not really a critique, just sort of a warning, I guess, about using beginner's resources like this. So, concluding thoughts. So, is this book worth $4.99 Canadian dollars or free on Kindle Unlimited? I do think so. I really do think so, as with all those caveats that I said, that it's intended for intensive reading for people who are beginners or lower intermediate who haven't done a lot of reading yet. It's just a nice way to kind of jumpstart your familiarity with reading and some of the vocabulary. But as I said before, it's not really like a substitute for the greater process of reading that you're about to get started on. And I mean, I think it's just worth the value, even if you don't care about Fingtam Languages as a YouTube channel or organization. And if you like the YouTube channel, that's a no-brainer in terms of supporting the channel. But even if you don't care about that, I think it's still good value. I mean, like, you look at other beginner resources, and honestly, they're not very good, typically. And so the fact that this is a legitimately good story and generally well written, I think that's really good, and it's definitely worth the money. And now my suggestion, again, is to work your way through the book. Look up, it's short enough where you can literally look up every word you don't know. It's probably a good idea at least once. And then maybe memorize, 100 words from it, 50 to 100 words that seem the easiest to remember. I recommend that. That would be a good idea. And then just move on. Don't try and nail every single word down. Don't try and memorize every single grammar idea. You just gotta let your brain have enough time to absorb the concept. So treat this as a very easy way to get started, but it's just a start, okay? And then after that, I suggest move on to something that's actually written for French speakers, native speakers. So the classic example is Harry Potter, and for good reason, because it doesn't use really difficult descriptive language or difficult sentence structure or anything like that. It does use the passé simple, but you'll get used to it, it's fine. And you already know the story, so your brain already has that head start of comprehensibility. So just by reading it, even if you don't look up a single word, your brain will get used to the language little by little, and you'll find that the clouds will part and you'll actually be able to sort of follow the story by the end. That was my experience. I didn't look up a single word when I read it for the first time. I just kind of plowed through it, and over time your brain just kind of gets used to it, and you'll get used to it too. But you just have to get used to feeling uncomfortable. No matter how much preparation you do, how much intensive reading you do, you're never going to be ready to read books until you actually read books. It's a paradox, but you have to get started. But believe me and trust me that it does get easier over time. I still don't think I'm very an advanced reader yet. I read a bit, but it does get easier over time, and it's totally worth it, right? Is there a better literary tradition than the French literature? It's one of the best in the world, and it's a great journey to be on, to kind of develop this level of reading, and not only new books but old books and everything in between. And it's exciting to be the beginning that this book, Le Petit Dragon, can represent that first step in that longer journey of experiencing what French culture and French literature can give you. So with that, hopefully this review is helpful for anyone, and I hope you have a good day.